This episode of Coffee House Shots is sponsored by Alliance Witten Investment Trust. From the OPEC oil crisis of the 1970s, the financial crash in 2008, to the COVID epidemic and Liz Truss's doomed premiership, there has been no shortage of economic crises over the last 58 years. And yet, throughout that time, every single year, without fail, we've paid out an increased dividend to our shareholders. In fact, Alliance Witten's history dates all the way back to 1888. And today, we manage around £5 billion in assets. If you're looking for a less stressful way to invest in stocks and shares, learn more about Alliance Witten and find your comfort zone.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm Lucy Dunn and today I'm joined by Katie Balls and Michael Simmons. This morning, the Office of National Statistics estimated that GDP had grown by 0.5% in February, suggesting that Rachel Reeves has managed to grow the economy. Michael, is this development unexpected?
Yeah, this is absolutely unexpected. You know, we've had all this talk that we could be heading towards a recession. And to put it into context, a 0.5% growth within a single month is like huge. Over a year, that works out at like 6%. So if this growth is real and sustained, then we'd be back to growth, not just that we have seen in sort of the pre-COVID times, but that'd be growth that we kind of saw up to the financial crash. So if that had happened, you know, Britain really would be going gangbusters. But there's some reasons to believe that these figures might be slightly overstated. So this is the monthly GDP figure for February, and there's quite often a lot of noise in that data. There's kind of trust issues with the Office for National Statistics as well. The government has just in the last few weeks announced a review because of so many revisions and issues with the data. So although it's good news, I think people are not celebrating just yet for kind of that reason. However, what the ONS also did today was they revised the January figure, which had seen a contraction to just no growth. So the revision there was going in the upward direction. And over the first 3 months of the year, so the first quarter, they said growth was 0.6%. And that's slightly more reliable because, you know, it's over multiple months. So there is good news for Rachel Reeves. However, I don't think it means that all the talk of, you know, recession and Britain's growth problems that we've had over the last few months are just going to go away, because none of these figures take in the national insurance tax rises that have just come in. They don't take in any of, you know, the tumult that we've spoken about on the podcast this week because of Trump's tariffs. So I think, you know, the next few months and the next few quarters of figures are probably going to be more like what we're used to. But that said, there is wider sort of economic survey data that, although doesn't have growth anywhere near as high as the figures are today, they are sort of tipping up in an upwards direction. So we'll have to see what happens when the tax rises filter in through the economy and when the effects of the now withdrawn Trump tariffs and the kind of market problems that caused, when that comes in to see how it's really affected the figures. But I mean, today, certainly on the face of it, even with all these caveats, it's a good news story for Britain's economy.
And Katie, does this morning's news suggest that Labour's growth agenda is finally working? And is Donald Trump's trade war, is that sort of threatening to undo the progress that we've seen today?
I think it's ultimately just too early to tell, partly for the reasons that Michael just set out. Now, it's a bit unexpected. Perhaps it does suggest that we've all been a bit too negative on this government that keeps talking about growth but hasn't had anything to point to yet. And when it comes to different stats which have given Rachel Reeves a bit of breathing space, she's had it on inflation a few times. I think this is going to be news that is greeted in the Treasury. But we know that lots of the steps that Rachel Reeves is taking on growth are ones which number 10 in the Treasury themselves see as medium to long term. So, for example, the Heathrow third runway, no one thinks that is going to happen in this term of a Labour government. Let's see how many terms they get from this point onwards. It could well happen when there's a different, party in power. Then you have the things I think which are more medium term. So you look at how the OBR scored, planning reform and others. There's a question as to whether this boost in growth, it does overlap with a change in rhetoric from the Labour government. If you think about Rachel Reeves' big growth speech, when the government started talking a lot more about we have no time for bat tunnels, the Labour's personal war on bats has, upped pace. But certainly that rhetoric of we are going to take on, Quango's invested interest groups, those trying to stop it, you could link some of this to the fact that at least on the question of planning versus some of the environmental concerns and so forth, I think in recent months, Labour has shown that they are willing to probably take some decisions that will upset parts of the left and, certain interest groups. And there has been a consistent line from Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. So again, we can't say this is here to stay and so forth, but it's a good news day for the Treasury for a change. That's what we do know. And secondly, I think that you can at least link it back to where you can give the Chancellor credit. It's obviously there's lots of things you can criticise, and that's happened many times in this podcast. But I think on some of the growth measures they want to push through are things that the Tories were a bit shy about doing or found too difficult to do because of backbench concerns. And there has been a fairly clear narrative on that.
Katie, you mentioned number 10. Have there been movements in staffing in Downing Street recently?
Yes, there's been news in the past couple of days of a little bit of a mini SPAD reshuffle or SPAD clear out. Now, of course, this is very bubble news and probably not what the voters across the country thinking about the local elections in 1st of May. They are so lucky as to be able to get to cast a vote are thinking about when it comes to those ballots. But these things are always interesting because they tell us something. And there appears to be a bit of a clear out of some of the policy advisors in 10 Downing Street, some in health policy and others. And it's hard to say, with individuals what the specifics are. But certainly I think the mood music coming from those in government is that it points to the fact that Keir Starmer's been quite frustrated, potentially, about, we know he's been frustrated at Whitehall. We've heard about, the tepid bath. We know he's been frustrated at civil servants. There's been obviously this effort to say efficiency and so forth, and a frustration that when you try and pull a lever, it doesn't really do anything. And that now seems to be extending to some of the policy work within Labour. So some are going, and therefore you expect new candidates to come in. Liz Lloyd, formerly, former Blair figure, I think this is seen as a strengthening of her hand. Someone who is having more power as a result of some of those who've been around longer in this iteration of Starmer's government, if that makes sense. Not longer in the grand scheme of politics going. And I think it poses an interesting question, which is, you obviously had Sue Gray out, and some of these appointments and also some of the ministerial appointments obviously date back to the Sue Gray era. So there's always like to be change when you have new figures in charge. This is now the Morgan McSweeney era in terms of chief of staff. But of course, the more you say, oh, this isn't working, so we'll change that, civil service, these spads aren't working, I think the more the pressure is on you because you're running out of others to blame. So perhaps this will be the start of a policy shift and clearer delivery from the government. But certainly in Labour circles, this is a talk of much chatter.
OK, so Health Secretary Wes Streeting is hoping to make the health service more efficient. And we've heard this week that he's planning to cut around 300,000 patients off of the waiting list. Michael, will this make any real difference to NHS backlogs?
I mean, it will if it works. Getting 300,000 people off the list, or 300,000 appointments, because some of them are multiple people, off the list, which I think is currently at over 7.4 million. That will be, a start at getting this list down. If you sort of read about the scheme, what it seems to be is they're basically going to pay hospitals to review who's on the list and say, oh, if you've got like a common back problem or a common eye problem, then you can just be sent to a part of the community service. But I think the rightful sort of criticism to this might be, well, why haven't NHS boards and hospitals just been doing this anyway? And is them being specifically financially incentivized to do it, is that really going to make enough of a difference? I mean, it strikes me that hospital administrators, doctors, it's not in their interests, clearly, for there to be a massive waiting list. And I don't think the fact that they weren't being paid by the health department to sort it out directly is part of the problem. So I think people will be skeptical that this will really work. That said, it's another one of these things where maybe, as Katie was pointing out about some of the sort of measures that Labour want to bring on to boost growth, maybe this is actually sort of an obvious point for the NHS that the last government just didn't go, far enough on measures to tackle the waiting list that they maybe felt like politically they couldn't get away with, but Labour have that kind of capital to do so. So if it works, it will be welcome. This is like when we talk about the NHS in crisis and the NHS clogged up. I mean, this is it. It's the beginning, the middle, and the end of the problem. The fact that there's waiting lists before you can even access to get a diagnosis, and once you've got the diagnosis, there's then another waiting list. This is what's clogging us up. We often talk about A&Es being like the critical falling point of the NHS, but I think really the real sort of custard that clogs the whole thing is this waiting list. So anything that does tackle that problem will be lauded, but I think there'll be rightful skepticism about whether this scheme actually makes a difference.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Katie. And thank you for listening.